to the Haunted Hollers podcast, a place where your hosts, Wendy and April, discuss the creepy things that lurk in the misty shadows of the Appalachian Hills. I am, as always, the mysterious voice in the walls.
Hey everybody, I'm Wendy.
And I'm April. Today's tale deals with a relentless spirit who is believed to kill people from beyond the grave. In 1938, Carl Pruitt and his wife lived in Pulaski County, Kentucky. The fateful day these events were set into motion was a typical day, and Carl was returning home from his work as a carpenter. However, it was about to become anything but typical, because when Carl entered the home, he caught his wife engaging in a torrid affair with another man. Carl was enraged, and his wife's lover was able to make a fast getaway during the initial confusion and yelling, but she had to stay behind and face her husband's wrath. He was so infuriated by her betrayal that he pulled out a length of chain he had on him from work and used it to strangle her to death. Once the act was done and his rage subsided into grief, he then took a gun and ended his own life. As tragic as this story is, this was only the beginning of the grief and horror that was to come. His wife's family did not want the monster that killed their daughter to be buried next to her, much less in the same cemetery. The story goes that to satisfy the grieving loved ones, Carl and his wife were buried in cemeteries on opposite ends of the county. After Carl was laid to rest, people began noticing something strange about his graveside. The phenomena is described in two different commonly told stories. One says that something strange was going on in the grass growing over his grave. It seemed that there were strange yellowing patches of grass that appeared to resemble links of a chain. The other says that his tombstone itself began to have yellow discolorations appear that resembled links of a chain, and that these discolorations continued to appear until it formed the shape of a cross. Obviously, when these stories began circulating among the residents, the gravesite began to draw the wrong kind of attention. A teenage boy decided to prove his bravery, and in front of an audience of his friends, he threw a rock at Pruitt's gravestone, causing it to chip. The teens then took off on their bikes, but their fun was cut short by a horrendous event none of them saw coming. The boy who had thrown the rock was speeding along when the sprocket of his bike broke. This caused him to wreck, and in the process the bike chain wrapped around his neck, choking him to death. It is said that later, when it was checked, the chip on the gravestone had miraculously disappeared. The boy's mother, distraught over her son's death, soon sought revenge herself, blaming the spirit of Pruitt for murdering her son. She went to his gravesite and took an axe to the gravestone, chopping the stone into smaller pieces. She was later found tangled up and hanging from her clothesline. After her death, the gravestone returned to its unblemished state. Shortly after this incident, a local farmer was riding by the grave in a horse-drawn wagon with a few family members who had all heard the stories of the cursed tombstone. He stated that he was not afraid of ghosts and fired his revolver several times at the headstone. Chunks flew from the stone, and the horses became frightened from the shots. The horses began to run, which caused the wagon to veer out of control. The family members jumped to safety, yet the farmer held on to the reins. The wagon went around a curve, and the farmer was thrown from his seat. His neck was caught on a chain, and the pulling from the horses caused it to snap. As always, the headstone showed no signs of damage after the farmer's death. Carl Pruitt's gravestone quickly became known as cursed among the people of the town. Because of this, 2 police officers were summoned to go to the grave to investigate. They did not take the accusation seriously, and one even made jokes about the curse and Carl's grave while they were there taking photographs of it. When the officers left the site, one happened to glance in the rearview mirror and discovered that they were being followed by a large ball of light. This was terrifying, and the officer driving, who had been the one to joke about the legend, sped up in an attempt to outrun it. His driving became more frantic and reckless until he swerved off the road and crashed between 2 fence posts. The officer in the passenger side was thrown from the car and escaped with minimal injuries. The driver, on the other hand, was found dead in the driver's seat with a chain from the fence post wrapped so tightly around his neck that it had nearly decapitated him. People in the town began to avoid the cemetery completely after this incident. A die-hard skeptic in the community decided to prove once and for all that there was nothing to the curse but a bunch of superstitious nonsense. One night he set out to the graveyard with a chisel and a hammer. People who lived near the cemetery reported hearing pounding sounds coming from the cemetery, followed by an unearthly scream. When the sounds were investigated, the man was found dead by the cemetery gates. The chain that was used to secure them was wrapped tightly around his neck. Family members of others who were interred in this cemetery began to have their loved ones moved to other resting sites. Carl had no living family willing to take care of his grave, and soon the cemetery became overgrown and completely abandoned, with only his grave remaining. According to the local stories, the cemetery was bulldozed over in 1958 and turned into a strip mine. The spirit of Carl Pruitt, referred to as the Chain Strangler, has claimed no further victims.
And now it's time for the breakdown. So I think the big question here is, can taking so much anger and hostility to your grave cause your final resting place to be cursed?
I think there's some interesting things to unpack here.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot.
So some of the notes that I wrote down, maybe his spirit felt that he was wronged enough by being cheated on and having to find out in such a way that the desecration of the grave was just too much. But my question about all of that is, the desecration of the grave didn't start until after the chain links started appearing. So what do we think the chain links mean? So we know that the story goes, he was so angry, he killed his wife, and once he, realized, oh gosh, what did I do? Then he was just so racked by grief that he killed himself.
Yeah, he did feel guilty after doing that.
So I think that the appearance of the chain, whether it was in the grass over his grave or whether it was on the tombstone itself, is really interesting. So how do we think the chains showed up there?
Is that like a penance to remind him of what he did, or to remind the world of what he did?
That's possible. Maybe especially the chain in the one story where it shows up on the tombstone itself. It talks about how the chain links formed a cross, and so I thought that was just a really interesting detail to be included in the story.
Maybe that's a lesson learned. Maybe other people need to learn. Don't let your anger overcome you.
It's a good point.
I understand. I can understand in the beginning him being angry. No one wants to walk in on that situation. No one wants, that would be a horrible, horrible thing. But he might have taken the wrong way out. You're angry. There's better ways to handle that.
Probably should have slept on it.
Yeah. Let's give that 24 hours and then decide how we want to handle it. But yeah, and maybe that's a lesson. Seeing that symbol, seeing that maybe that's a lesson to think things through before you act in anger. And there's so many ways we can look at that as a symbol.
So if we think that that's a symbol meant for him, meaning that it's some kind of a reminder to him and maybe to others as well,
right?
But more so directed at him, like a, look what you did kind of thing. That kind of brings some interesting thought into the desecration part of it. Because especially if it's on the tombstone and it's supposed to be some kind of penance or reminder to him, wouldn't his ghost want that to be destroyed?
True. That does make sense, yes. So, where's all this anger coming from? Where's all this curse and revenge coming from? That's a good question.
Yeah.
So, in my research, we could not find any evidence of people in the story actually existing.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because, there are a lot of specific places talked about, and there's a lot of specific names that are talked about. But when you go to find examples or find evidence of this, there's no newspaper articles. And if this happened in the 30s and on up until, possibly the 50s, whenever we said that the site was bulldozed in 58, there were newspapers. That was, there wasn't an internet, but there's newspapers and things like that there should be a record of. Now, one thing I thought was interesting, and there wasn't a date as to when this happened, but one of the articles that I looked at said that there was a courthouse fire in Pulaski County. So that destroyed all the paper records, so there's no local death certificate. And the people who had written that had gone on to do more research, and they said the closest thing that they could find was a death certificate from 1950 that happened in Louisville, and the death certificate was for someone named Pruitt, Carl Pruitt, possibly, but Carl Pruitt's name is always spelled Pruitt, and this is spelled Prewitt. Pruitt.
That's a big
And
difference.
so there's a difference there. But it did list on this person's death certificate that they died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound.
Okay. Yeah, that's a big coincidence there. So, that's a big coincidence in and of itself, that there was a fire that burned the records. But I do think that if we had a murder-suicide, I feel like you would be able to find a newspaper article about that.
Yeah, there would definitely, with a murder-suicide in, like, I don't know, what town was this in?
Well, it's a Pulaski County. It didn't say the town.
They had to have had a newspaper.
Oh, I'm sure.
At least a newspaper focused on that county.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that, I mean, it just seems inconceivable that it would not show up in the newspaper.
And then also, all of the deaths
Yeah.
that were talked about. None of those. There's no record.
There's no record of any of that in the newspapers or that we could
newspaper.
find online. So I thought it was okay. So there's like 5 deaths attributed to this tombstone. And if any of that was true, surely there's something written about it out there somewhere. You know, somebody would have written a book, somebody would have, written a newspaper article, something would exist. Because, the 30s, in 1938, that's not all that long ago, really, if we're thinking about in technological advancements and stuff. And, even up until 1958, I know that we're kind of old, but that doesn't
for
feel like that's that long ago.
Right. So, yeah, between the newspaper articles, but this story has enough detail. It has so much detail that it almost makes you feel like it's true. There's a lot of detail to this story, and there's just more and more added to it that to me gives the story a lot to make it feel like it's true.
Well, and one thing I thought was interesting, one of the stories talks about a farmer in a horse-drawn wagon with family members, and I was kind of trying to orient that in my mind as to time period, because then it talks about the policeman being in a car,
Right.
and so I thought that was kind of an interesting disconnect there.
Yeah, as I was researching and I saw that story about the farmer, I thought, would they be in a wagon in this time? But then I thought, I don't know, maybe it's one of those weird overlaps where some people were in cars and some weren't. I don't know.
Possibly.
Believe it or not, I'm not that old, so I don't know what was going on in that time.
Right.
I think the next question is, could these events actually happen? So the events that happen to the individual people, are these things that could actually happen?
Well, okay. So the kid riding the bicycle and the chain snapping, or the sprocket breaking and him having a wreck and it getting wrapped around his neck, that seems a little improbable.
Right.
to me.
I was with it all the way up until the chain wrapping around.
Yeah, because I was thinking where the chain is on a bike and how it's going to pop up. Even
Yeah.
if you're a small kid on a little bike, that's still some distance to
Yeah.
get around. I don't
Yeah.
know about that.
These were definitely teenagers. So when I'm thinking of that, I just don't, that's not plausible.
Unless we're thinking it's some kind of final destination scene
Right.
where death is, moving the chain to get revenge. It seems improbable to me that could happen. And then with the mother,
The clothesline. My family had a clothesline for years.
mine did too, but it was never high enough that you could be hanged from
No.
it.
You have
Especially-
to really jump up on it. It'd be a challenge.
Especially, if you had clothes on it, weighing it down.
Right.
I'm not seeing that. And even if you were twisting yourself up in it, I just don't think that's plausible.
Yeah.
The way that it's hanging.
That one didn't make sense to me either.
Yeah. I'm not thinking that one.
Now, the farmer being in the runaway wagon, possibly getting his
Possibly.
neck snapped. If we're talking about horses tethered to a wagon, there's all kinds of, I don't know about chains, but
Yeah.
there's definitely leads and things that are working in there. I don't know about chains on a wagon like that, though.
No. But I could see you scaring your horses.
Oh, yeah, and
firing
possibly
guns.
that creating some kind of an accident and possibly a death. So that one seems, so far, the most probable one to me.
The wrecking of the police officers, I was with them all the way up until the wreck. how did the chain get around his neck?
Well, that was my question. Even if you're in a car, now that one would be more believable to me if they were in a wagon.
Yeah.
Because if you're in a wagon and you go between two fence posts and there's a chain there, sure, I can see that happening. But you're in a car? How is this chain going to get in the car? You know, did it go through the windshield? I mean, you'd about have to take the top off the car, I would think, for something like that to be
Right.
probable. And also, what's with the ball of light chasing the police car?
Exactly.
That's the only one where something like that seems to show up.
And let's go to the gravestone. It's getting destroyed. It's getting chipped.
Okay. I want to know what kind of an axe this mother had that is capable of chopping up a gravestone,
Yeah.
which, you know, we think of those as being made out of like marble or
Right.
granite or some kind of heavy duty stone. I don't know what kind of an axe this woman had, but it apparently is an axe of legend. So,
And how does this thing miraculously go back?
right.
How does it go back together?
Yeah. I mean, if there's something supernatural going on there.
I'm too sciencey. I'm too sciencey
No,
to believe that.
I don't know.
No, I don't think so.
I don't get that. But the final death of the man in the graveyard at night, that one is the most probable of all of them to me. Because if there's a chain on the gate post and that's maybe strung between the gate, and he's out there in the graveyard in the middle of the night, he sees something that spooks him and he takes off running, I can see him maybe running into that.
And even if that didn't happen, if he finished up his job of beating on the gravestone, maybe leaving the cemetery, he sort of got his senses got the best of him.
Yeah.
And that is a little more plausible.
That is plausible. Yes. So, is it a good ghost story?
Absolutely.
Certainly.
Definitely.
It has all the makings of a good ghost story. Do I think people have added to it over the years? 100%. I think different things have been added to it because there are different variations. There are variations as to what happened to his grave. One was the strip mine bulldozed. One was the whole town just moved away from the grave. So that they wouldn't have to deal with the curse anymore.
That would be impressive. Just like the entire next city council is like, no, we all agree to shut down the
Yes.
city and
We are done with
it
this.
out.
We're
We're
not
done.
losing any more people. We are done with this curse. We're all just going to move. All those in favor?
So my question, if this story is true, how come the bulldozers weren't cursed?
Oh.
I mean, if this story is true, and, you know, I don't care how evil somebody was, if they're getting ready to clear land for some kind of commercial production like a strip mine, they're not just going to leave some dude's body in there.
Oh, no.
But, I mean, let's assume they did. Let's assume they just left it there and they're going to bulldoze the whole thing. If you're bulldozing over the tombstone, you're desecrating it, you're breaking it up the same way as happened in the other stories. Why were none of those people affected?
The spirit was too tired by then. he was exhausted.
Yeah.
He had ran out of anger.
There's only so much you can do with a chain, so he was out of ideas.
That's true.
But yeah, I agree with that. So, is this kind of like an urban legend?
It really put me a lot in mind of the Octavia Hatcher gravestone pranks that, you know, people in the town were going out there and turning her grave statue around. It really had a lot of that vibe to me. So I feel like local urban legend. But at the same time, those are usually teach some kind of a lesson. And I'm kind of failing to see what the lesson is here, unless it's, you know, as you mentioned, don't let your anger get the best of you.
Or don't touch someone else's gravestone?
Possibly be respectful.
Be respectful. You never know what might happen. Surely, and I would like to say this, everyone knows not to go and touch other people's gravestones
You
and
would
desecrate
think.
them. However, we see the news.
Yeah, stuff happens.
There are those people out there.
people are dumb.
So maybe this was an urban legend developed to let those people see, hey, this might be why you don't want to do this. You might be cursed.
Yeah.
So maybe it's a lesson like that.
Yeah, it's possible. When
But-
I think about the story, though, I mean, it almost makes more sense to me if the wife was the one who became the ghost.
Right.
Seeing as how she was the one who was murdered, despite the fact that she was engaging in illicit activities. It made more sense to me that she would be the ghost because she was the one that was murdered. Like, I was trying to reconcile how the husband is the one who becomes the ghost here, the angry, vengeful spirit.
That makes sense. But we can agree, it is a very good ghost story.
It is definitely a good
10 out
ghost
of 10.
story. You can contact us on Facebook and Instagram at Haunted Hollers. You can also send us an email at hauntedhollers@gmail.com. And we also have a webpage, www.hauntedhollers.com. Hey listeners, if you're enjoying the podcast, we would love to hear what you think. If you wouldn't mind, stop by Apple Podcast or Spotify or wherever you get your podcast and leave us a rating and a review.
Until next time, listeners, beware of things lurking in the shadows.